Before we look at why your adoption framework is failing, hit subscribe on M365 FM. We track this stuff every day. Most companies think their Copilot rollout failed because of change management. It didn't. It failed because of the model underneath it. Here's the tension nobody wants to name out loud. The Cloud Adoption Framework and the M365 Adoption Guide both promise to eliminate common failure points. That is the actual language they use. And yet, most organizations still hit the exact same wall. The same governance mess, the same stalled teams rollout, the same Copilot licenses sitting unused. By the end of this episode, you are going to understand the difference between deploying M365 and actually integrating it into how your business works. You will see why 73% of deployments make the exact same governance mistake. Over and over, regardless of company size or industry, here are the stakes. If you do not fix the model underneath your rollout, Copilot cannot fix it for you. It just runs the same dysfunction faster. The promise. Nobody reads past the headline. Go read the Microsoft documentation right now, and you will find this line. Proven guidance to be successful in Azure. It sounds solid, it feels battle-tested, thousands of deployments, best practices baked in. And it is not wrong exactly, but it is also not the whole story, because being successful in Azure and being successful as a business are two completely different outcomes. The framework assumes you will figure out the gap yourself. Barbara Forbes is an Azure MVP who has watched a lot of these rollouts go sideways. She uses a specific comparison for this. On-prem used to work like a policeman standing in an intersection. Every request went through a person. That person said yes or no, and it was slow, but it was controlled. The cloud replaced that policeman with a roundabout. No one is stopping you at a light anymore. You get freedom, you get speed, you get delegated responsibility, but there are still guardrails, still lanes, still a structure you are supposed to follow. But here's the problem. Just because you build a roundabout does not mean people know how to drive through one. You can put up the signs, you can paint the lines, you can follow every design spec in the documentation, and you will still end up with cars stuck in the middle because nobody taught the drivers what a yield actually means. The structure existed, but the behavior never changed to match it. That is exactly what happens with M365. Microsoft hands you the roundabout, Teams, SharePoint, Copilot. A whole stack of governance tools are sitting there ready to go. And the assumption baked into the rollout is that people will just know. They will know where files go. They will know which tool to use for which conversation. They will know that share with anyone is a decision, not a default. Nobody forces anyone to learn the traffic rules. So people drive through however they used to drive through the old intersection. Now you have the same bad habits, just running on a new platform with better branding. This is the core idea of this channel. I'm going to keep coming back to it all episode. The model, not the framework. The model, the framework. KF, the M365 adoption guide. None of that is what is breaking. What is breaking is the assumption sitting underneath the framework. It is the quiet belief that structure alone changes behavior. It does not. A roundabout does not teach anyone to yield. A landing zone does not teach anyone what data belongs where. A license does not teach anyone why they should change how they have worked for the last 10 years. So if the framework is not the problem, and the tools are not the problem, what exactly is everyone getting wrong? That is section 2. Why adoption fails. It's never the technology. Here's the finding that shows up in every piece of research on this topic. It isn't subtle. M365 rarely fails because of the tools. Not once in the data does SharePoint is confusing or Teams is buggy show up as the root cause of a failed rollout. The tools work, they have always worked. That is not where the breakdown happens. Microsoft's own adoption guidance admits this directly, and it is worth sitting with that for a second. Their documentation says adoption projects fail when people do not understand why they need to change their behavior. Read that again. Not when people don't understand the interface, not when training is insufficient, when they don't understand why. That is Microsoft, the company selling you the tools, telling you the tools were never the bottleneck. So if it is not the tools, where is the gap? It is in how differently everyone inside the organization interprets the same rollout. IT treats go live as a deployment event. Boxes checked, tenant configured, licenses assigned, done. Employees experience the exact same rollout as a UI update, new buttons, new logos, same job. Executives see it as a line item, money spent, checked off in a board deck. 3 groups, 3 completely different definitions of finished. And none of them match what adoption actually requires. The real failure sits in the space between license activated and behavior changed. That gap is invisible on a dashboard. You can have 100% license activation and 0% behavior change. And from the license report, everything looks perfect. This is the gap where entire transformation budgets quietly disappear. And here is a number that should change how you read every rollout report you have ever received. Unmanaged rollouts, the kind where IT flips the switch and hopes for the best, plateau around 30% effective adoption. Structured change programs, the ones that actually address behavior instead of access, hit 70% or higher. Same tools, same licenses, same company size. The only variable that moves the needle that much is whether anyone designed for behavior change on purpose. Now here's the moment that should actually break something in how you think about this. Usage numbers going up can still mean adoption is failing. Say that sits wrong with you for a second because it should. You can watch Teams messages climb, watch SharePoint edits climb, and watch every chart in your reporting tool point up and to the right, and still be looking at a failed adoption. Because rising activity does not tell you whether people changed how they work. It just tells you they are doing something inside the tool. Confusion generates activity too. So does duplicated effort. So does 5 people recreating the same file because nobody agreed on where it should live in the first place. This is the belief most leaders walk into these rollouts holding, and it is wrong. The belief that activity is the finish line, it is not. Activity is just noise until you know what it is actually measuring. So if the tools are not the problem, and activity is not proof of success, you're probably wondering what Microsoft's own framework actually tells you to do about any of this. Strategy. The step. Everyone skips or fakes. So here's what the framework actually says to do first. Before you touch a single Azure resource, before you provision a single tenant setting, you are supposed to answer one question: why are we moving at all? That is it. That is step one. And here's the part that should bother you. Half the companies going through this skip it completely. Not because they are careless, but because they already have the technology sitting in front of them, and we have the technology starts feeling like a reason on its own. It is not. It is just an excuse dressed up as momentum. Barbara Forbes calls this out with a pattern she has seen over and over. A company's hardware is running out of support in 3 months, so suddenly everyone is scrambling to migrate, and the whole thing gets framed as strategy. It is not strategy. It is a deadline wearing a strategy's clothes. Nobody sat down and asked what they wanted the business to look like on the other side. They just knew the old servers were about to become a liability, and moving fast felt like the only option. That is not direction. That is panic with a project plan attached. The framework actually gives you a real vocabulary for this, and it is worth using instead of guessing. There are migration triggers. These are about cost, complexity, and agility. Basically getting out from under something that is slowing you down. And there are innovation triggers. These are about scale, new markets, and capability you cannot build on your own. Like AI features you would never develop in-house. Neither one is better, but you have to know which one you're actually chasing because the plan looks completely different depending on the answer. A migration trigger wants you moving fast and cutting cost. An innovation trigger wants you experimenting and building new capability. Confuse the two and you will build the wrong thing efficiently. And here is where it gets expensive if you skip this step. If leadership does not know why you are doing this, somebody with budget authority is going to ask that question halfway through the project. Usually right when costs start climbing past the first estimate. And if there is no answer sitting ready, funding gets pulled. Not because the project failed technically, but because nobody upstairs ever agreed on what success was supposed to look like. You cannot defend a number nobody understands the purpose of. This is why business justification is not optional paperwork. It is the thing that ties the whole strategy together. You are supposed to build an actual financial model here, not a guess. Tools like the TCO calculator let you compare what your current infrastructure actually costs against what the cloud would cost, side by side, with real numbers. The pricing calculator gives you a monthly estimate before you commit to anything. And once you're actually running, cost management gives you live visibility into what you are spending versus what you projected. None of this is decoration. It is the thing that turns "we think this will save money" into "here is the model showing exactly how." So if you take nothing else from this section, take this. Strategy was never about the cloud. It is not about which tools you pick or how fast you can deploy them. Strategy is direction, a destination that everyone in the room, IT, finance, the business side, actually agrees on before anyone starts building anything. Once you know why you are doing this, you still have not answered who is actually going to carry it. Planning, centralized, shared, or total chaos. Now you're actually planning. And the first decision on the table is, who runs this thing? The framework gives you 3 models to pick from. Centralized means one team controls everything, every deployment, every policy, every approval. It's that policeman standing in the intersection again. Shared management is the roundabout model. You delegate responsibility, but you do it inside guardrails everyone agreed on ahead of time. Then there's decentralized. This is basically where everyone gets a piece of Azure and figures it out on their own. But here's the thing about decentralized that surprises people. It's not automatically the wrong choice. If you're a startup with 10 people and no legacy baggage, decentralized can actually make sense. The problem isn't the model itself. The problem is that almost nobody picks it on purpose. It's not a decision. It's what happens when nobody makes a decision at all. A team needed resources, nobody said no. And 6 months later, that's just how the company operates. That's not planning. That's an accident with a name attached after the fact. Once you've picked a model, you have to figure out what happens to your applications. This is where the 6 R's come in. And they're worth understanding by what they actually do. Not just as a list of words. Rehost means you move it as is, no code changes, same setup, just running somewhere new. Replatform means small adjustments. You move into a managed database or a web app service without touching much code. Refactor goes further. You make actual code changes so you can take advantage of platform features. Re-architect means redesigning the whole thing. Maybe you break it into microservices. Maybe you move it to containers. Rebuild means starting over from scratch, because the existing code isn't worth saving. And retain or replace means you either leave it alone or you drop it for something that already does the job. But here's a bias worth correcting. Rehost, the lift and shift option, gets treated like the embarrassing choice. People think you only pick it if you didn't have time to do it properly. That reputation isn't fair. If your hardware is failing and you only have 3 months, lift and shift isn't lazy, it's the correct call for the constraints you're actually working under. You don't get the full benefit of the platform right away, but you get out of danger. You can modernize later once you aren't in crisis mode. None of this technical planning matters if the people side gets ignored. This is where skills readiness plans come in. They aren't a nice to have, they are part of the plan itself. You need to know who needs to understand what, and at what level, before anyone starts touching Azure resources. Skipping this doesn't save time, it just moves the confusion from the planning phase into production, where it's much more expensive to fix. This is where most organizations think they're ready. They're not, because there's a stage nobody plans enough time for. Ready, the landing zone isn't the finish line. So you're finally at the stage where you build something real. And this is where most technical teams feel like they've arrived. You haven't. What you're building here is called a landing zone. The name tells you exactly what it is. If you listen to it, it's the structure everything else lands on. It's not the goal, it's not the win, it's the ground floor you build so the actual workloads have somewhere safe to go. But here's where teams get this wrong. Because a landing zone gives you access to management groups and policies. There's a pull toward building every single piece just because it's available. You can create 10 management groups, you can write 40 policies. That doesn't mean you should. Every extra layer you build because you can is one more thing someone has to understand later. It's one more piece of structure that has to make sense to a person who wasn't in the room when you built it. Overbuilding doesn't make you safer. It makes the whole thing harder to reason about. And confusion at this level costs you later, usually right when you can least afford it. One of the more useful distinctions here is the split between corporate and online landing zones. It comes down to a single question for every resource you place. Does this thing need to talk to everything else? Or does it just need a path outside? That's the whole decision. A resource that only needs external access doesn't need to be wired into your entire internal network. Giving it that access anyway isn't generous. It's exposure you didn't need to create. And here's the principle underneath all of it. The safest connection is no connection at all. If something doesn't need to talk to your core network, don't connect it. Every connection you add is a door. And every door you don't need is a door someone eventually walks through by accident, or worse, on purpose. The instinct to connect everything just in case is exactly what this phase is supposed to train you out of. Now, here's where perfectionism quietly kills momentum. There's a trap in this stage where teams ask, are we ever really ready? If you let that question run unchecked, the honest answer is no. You will never have perfect governance. You will never close every policy gap before shipping something. If you wait for that state, you don't launch slower, you don't launch at all. I've watched teams sit in this exact phase for months. They refine a structure nobody has actually used yet, because ready kept moving further away the more they looked at it. The fix isn't complicated, even if it feels uncomfortable. Launch small, learn fast, keep improving. You don't need flawless governance before workload 1 goes live. You need enough governance that workload 1 is safe. Then you adjust as you learn what workload 1 actually needed. Perfect is not a prerequisite for shipping. It's usually the excuse for not shipping. And this is the part almost everyone gets backwards. The sequencing mistake that breaks everything. Most teams building in the cloud start with a flawed assumption. They assume there is a correct order. Build the platform first, get it solid, get it clean. Then, hand it off to the people who actually build things. That assumption is the mistake. Barbara Forbes has watched these rollouts for years, and her insight is blunt. Platform and workload have to move together, not one after the other. Not platform, then a pause, then the workload at the same time. That is the part nobody wants to hear. It sounds messier than a clean handoff, because in reality, it is messier. But messy and working beats clean and empty every single time. Here's what the sequential version looks like in practice. A company decides they are finally serious about the cloud. Their first move is standing up a cloud center of excellence. That sounds responsible. You get the experts in a room, you define the standards, you build the governance model, you do it properly before anyone starts deploying real work. But here's the problem. Nobody in that room has actually run a workload through that environment yet. They are designing rules for a game they haven't played. And the experts building it usually treat the moment the landing zone ships as the finish line. So what actually happens is teams end up stuck. You have a landing zone with gorgeous documentation. Every policy is defined, every management group is in place. It is a genuinely impressive piece of architecture, and it has 0 applications running through it. Nobody has touched it because nobody built it with a real workload's actual needs in mind. It is a beautiful empty building, all structure, no tenants. The model that actually works looks different. It is supposed to look overlapping. You build the landing zone, but you don't stop there to admire it. You immediately push a first workload through. That is the only way you find out what the landing zone actually got wrong. Then you figure out how to connect that workload to what it needs. Then you bring in the next 10 workloads, not because 10 is a magic number, but because at that scale you start seeing patterns the first one couldn't reveal. Then you secure what you have built based on what you now know, instead of what you guessed. Only then do you call something a production workload. Every one of those steps bleeds into the next. That overlap isn't sloppiness, it is the design. And here's the part that breaks most governance work. One size fits none. If your center of excellence hands every team the exact same standard, you haven't created consistency. You have created friction. The whole reason the cloud was worth adopting was flexibility. Treating every workload identically is how you quietly kill the thing you were trying to gain. And this is exactly where M365 rollouts fall into the same trap. It just has a different name. The M365 version of the same failure. Take that same sequencing mistake and translate it into M365 language. You will recognize it immediately. IT leads a Teams and SharePoint migration. They move the mailboxes, they provision the sites, they point the old file shares at new locations. Then, somebody sends the email that says Cutover complete. As far as the project plan is concerned, that is the finish line. Everyone gets a badge for shipping on time. Except Cutover isn't adoption. Cutover is just the technical move. Nobody's behavior has changed yet. Treating that email as the finish line is the same mistake as calling a landing zone done the day it ships. The research pattern here is consistent enough that it is almost boring. Adoption gets treated as a technical project from the start. Success is defined as everyone has an account. That is the bar, not everyone changed how they store a document. Not everyone knows where a decision should live. Just account exists, license assigned, box checked. It is the same trap as license activated from earlier, except now it is dressed up as a completed migration instead of a completed deployment. And here is what is missing every single time. There is no adoption workstream running next to the technical rollout. Not a smaller one, not a rushed one, none at all. There is no behavioral reinforcement built into the plan. No champions network seeded before go live to carry momentum into teams that IT will never reach. The technical team does its job. The migration succeeds by every metric they are tracking. And then everyone assumes behavior will follow the tools on its own. It won't. It never has. So what actually happens is predictable. Users take their old file share habits and rebuild them inside SharePoint. Same folder structures. Same final v2 really final naming conventions. Same permissions chaos. Just a different logo on the sharing dialog. Nothing about how people manage information actually improved. You spent real money moving the mess into a nicer container. The shell changed, the behavior didn't. And because nobody was watching for that specific failure, it goes unnoticed for months, sometimes years, until someone stumbles into a governance nightmare during an audit and asks how it got this bad. I made this point on LinkedIn recently, and it is worth repeating. Most M365 deployments fail before anyone even starts measuring activity. Not during the measurement, before it. The failure is baked in at the design stage. The plan only accounts for the technical migration. It never builds in a way to track whether behavior is actually shifting. By the time someone opens a usage dashboard, the failure already happened. The dashboard just hasn't caught up yet. Copilot makes this exact failure worse, and it makes it faster. Here's the pattern showing up right now in real rollouts. Licenses get enabled across the organization before anyone has defined the use cases. Nobody has decided which workflows Copilot is supposed to touch first. Nobody knows which teams need it most. Nobody knows what a good outcome even looks like. That isn't one failure. That is two failures stacked on top of each other. It is a governance failure because nobody decided what data Copilot should touch. And it is an adoption failure because nobody told anyone what problem this is supposed to solve. Enable first, figure it out later isn't a rollout strategy. It is the lift and shift instinct applied to AI, minus the lucky part where lift and shift at least gets you a working server. So if activity isn't the signal, what is? Let's talk about measurement, structural adoption versus feature usage. Research draws a hard line here. Most reporting tools completely blur it. Structural adoption measures if your organization is built to sustain a new way of working. Feature usage measures if people are clicking buttons. Those are not the same thing. If you treat them as the same, you end up celebrating a rollout that is quietly falling apart underneath the surface. Feature usage is what every dashboard shows you. Monthly active users, Teams messages sent, SharePoint edits logged, Copilot prompts fired off. It is real data. It is easy to pull, but it cannot prove transformation on its own. These numbers never tell you why someone opened Teams. Maybe they collaborated brilliantly on a project, or maybe they just could not find a file and sent 4 messages asking where it went. The number looks identical either way. Structural metrics ask a different question entirely. They are harder to pull because most organizations never bother setting them up. Training completion is a big one. Not just did we offer it, but did people actually finish it? Survey sentiment matters. Do people feel confident using the system? Or are they quietly working around it because it is too hard? Champion participation is another signal. Are the people meant to carry momentum into their teams actually showing up and doing that job? Then there is governance clarity. Can someone explain who owns a specific site or channel without having to guess? Support ticket trends tell the real story. Are the same confused questions still coming in 6 months after launch? Or did they taper off because people actually learned the system? These numbers move slower. They are less flattering in a slide deck. And that is exactly why so many organizations skip them and go straight to the feature usage numbers instead. But here's the problem. Rising usage numbers can mean confusion just as easily as they can mean success. More Teams messages does not automatically mean better collaboration. It might mean communication got more fragmented and scattered across channels. It might mean more people are asking the same question 5 different ways because there is no clear place to get an answer. A chart going up and to the right feels like proof. It isn't. It is just proof that something is happening. Not that the something is good. I want to be honest about adoption score here. It gets treated like a verdict. In reality, it is just a signal. Adoption score is a useful benchmark for comparing your usage to similar organizations. That comparison has value, but it is not proof of business value. It is a usage number wearing a success costume. It is dressed up to look like an outcome when it is actually just an activity count with better branding. Leaning on it alone is the same mistake as leaning on Teams messages alone, just with a friendlier name attached. So here's the fix. It is not complicated. It is just rarely done. Pair usage telemetry with surveys and actual business KPIs. Never trust one metric family by itself. Usage tells you what is happening. Surveys tell you how people feel about what is happening. Business KPIs tell you if any of it moved the outcomes leadership cares about. You need all three in the room together. If you use them in isolation, they will lie to you in different directions. Usage alone overstates activity as success. Surveys alone cannot prove behavior actually changed. And KPIs alone will not tell you why the number moved or why it stayed flat. Now let's talk about the part nobody wants to own. Governance. Governance bolted on is governance that fails. Here's the number that ties everything back together. 73% of Microsoft 365 deployments make the exact same governance mistake. Not similar mistakes, the same one. It happens across companies that have nothing else in common. Different industries, different sizes, different budgets. The mistake is this. They govern the tools instead of governing the platform as a system. Tool-centric governance is easy to miss from the inside. Permissions get configured app by app. Teams gets one set of rules, SharePoint gets another. OneDrive gets whatever the default happened to be the day it rolled out. There is no unified identity model tying it together. Because of that, the same person can end up with completely different access logic depending on which app they opened that morning. Ownership of individual teams and sites turns ambiguous fast. Someone spins up a team for a project. That project ends 6 months later. The team just sits there. It stays active. It holds whatever got shared inside it. This happens because nobody was ever assigned to close it out. When you multiply that by a few hundred sites, you get a sprawling mess with no single person accountable for any piece of it. System-level governance treats this completely differently. Identity, lifecycle, automation, and policy. All of it gets handled as one connected model that spans every workload. It is not 4 separate decisions made by 4 separate teams on 4 separate timelines. A team gets created with a life cycle attached to it from day one. An owner is assigned. An expiration policy is set to trigger. Identity rules apply the same way whether someone is in Teams, SharePoint, or Outlook. It is not glamorous work, but it is the difference between a platform you can understand and one where every question requires digging through a different admin panel to get an answer. If you get this wrong, the consequences are not abstract. They show up as real exposure. Data gets overexposed because sharing defaults never got locked down. Anyone with the link becomes the path of least resistance for people who just want to get their work done without asking IT for permission first. Compliance gaps sit there quietly until someone finds them during an audit, and an audit is exactly the wrong moment to discover a problem. By then, it is not a fix, it is a disclosure. This connects back to the conversation we had about Azure. Remember the network engineer who said the safest connection is no connection at all. That logic does not stay inside the network layer. It applies just as hard to sharing an access inside Microsoft 365. Every link set to anyone is a connection you did not need to create. Every guest account withstanding access to more than they are using is a door left open. It stays open because closing it felt like extra work nobody signed up for. The instinct that protects a network, which is to default to the minimum necessary, is the exact same instinct that protects a tenant. So what does good actually look like here? Baseline policies get defined before the rollout. They are not retrofitted after the fact once something has already gone wrong. Sharing defaults, retention rules, identity requirements. All of it is decided while the tenant is still empty. You do not want to patch these in after 300 sites already exist with inconsistent settings. Governance built this way is not a reaction to a problem. It is the thing that prevents the problem from having a chance to start. This is where the accountability question comes in, and it is uglier than most leaders admit. Accountability gaps, when everyone owns nothing. Research keeps surfacing a specific pattern. It's an uncomfortable one to sit with if you're the person who signed off on the budget. Sponsors exist to fund the project. They don't exist to own the behavior change that project was supposed to produce. What typically happens is simple. Someone in finance or leadership approves the spend. They get the project moving, they show up for the kickoff, and then, functionally, they disappear. They leave the part of the work that actually determines whether anything changes, because budget approval isn't the same as accountability. Treating it that way is how a rollout ends up fully paid for and half adopted. Once that gap opens up at the top, it spreads through the rest of the organization fast. IT assumes collaboration, design, and data protection belong to security. Security assumes it belongs to whoever is managing the Microsoft 365 tenant day-to-day. HR assumes it's an IT function because it lives inside software. Operations assumes someone already decided this months ago and they just never got the memo. Every single group has a reasonable sounding excuse for why it's not their job. And every one of those excuses is technically true from where they're standing. Nobody is lying. They're just all looking at each other, waiting for the person who's supposed to own this to step forward. But that person doesn't exist yet. This is exactly where the center of excellence quietly fails. It's a subtler failure than most people expect. On paper, the COE is supposed to be the group that owns this. In practice, it exists as documentation, a wiki page, a set of slides from the kickoff, a folder full of standards nobody is required to follow. It was never built as an enforced control plane. It has no actual authority to approve, block, or redirect decisions. It's a reference, not a rule book. And reference material doesn't stop anyone from doing something risky. It just sits there so people can point to it after the fact and say the guidance existed. This is the gap a RASI model is built to close. It's worth being plain about what those letters actually mean, instead of treating it like jargon. Responsible is the person doing the work. Accountable is the person who answers for whether it got done right. There should only ever be one of those per decision. Consulted is everyone whose input matters before a call gets made. Informed is everyone who just needs to know once it has. If you skip this structure, you don't get flexibility, you get paralysis. Decisions stall because 3 different people think they're the one who's supposed to approve something. Or worse, none of them think it's them. Instructions conflict because 2 different teams gave 2 different answers to the same question. Nobody above them noticed until a user got caught in the middle. You can see this play out in real time with Copilot. Rollouts stall constantly for exactly this reason. A team wants to use it for a new workflow that is genuinely useful, but the request just sits there. It isn't because the technology can't support it. It's because nobody can say with confidence who is allowed to approve a new AI use case. Is it security's call, legal's, its, the business unit's own? In an organization without clear accountability, the answer is often, let's set up a meeting to figure out who decides. And that meeting takes 3 weeks to schedule. So let's go back to the model that actually works when this is done right. What good actually looks like, the adopt loop. The path Barbara Forbes lays out when things go right is worth stating plainly. It's simpler than the failure mode we just walked through. Landing zone, first workload, connect, first 10 workloads, secure, first production workload, 6 steps. And none of them wait politely for the one before it to be finished. Why does this loop actually work when the sequential version doesn't? Because it forces platform teams and workload teams to keep talking to each other the whole way through. They don't just meet once at kickoff and then again at the post-mortem. When a workload goes through the connect phase, the platform team learns something real about what their landing zone got wrong. Now there's an actual application sending actual traffic through it. That's better than a policy document describing traffic in the abstract. That feedback has nowhere to go if the platform team already packed up and moved on. The loop only works if both sides are still in the room. And here's exactly what happens when they're not. Platform engineers ship the landing zone, call it done, and shift their attention elsewhere. From their side, the job is complete. The structure exists, the policies are attached, box checked, except nobody has actually run a workload through it yet. So nobody has found the gaps or the awkward permission boundaries. Nobody found the policy that blocks a legitimate use case because nobody thought to test for it. 6 months later, a workload team hits that wall. And there's no one left who considers it their problem to fix. The workload team didn't build the landing zone, so they don't feel empowered to change it. The platform team already moved on, so they don't feel responsible for touching it again. That's not a technical gap. That's an ownership gap. It's the same shape as the accountability problem we just looked at. It's just showing up one layer down. The fix isn't complicated to describe, even if it takes discipline to hold on to. Shared responsibility. Designs get built together. Platform and workload people stay in the same conversation. You stop one side from finishing their piece and lobbing it over a wall for the other side to deal with. When a workload team pushes back on a policy, that isn't friction to root around. That is the exact signal the landing zone needs to actually improve. You have to treat it as data, not as a complaint. This maps directly onto Microsoft 365. The shape is identical even though the players have different job titles. Instead of platform and workload teams, you've got a champions network, IT, and business ownership. The principle applies word for word. These groups need to work the loop continuously. They cannot hand off to each other in sequence. I can't build the tenant, declare the cutover complete, and hand a stack of documentation to champions. They can't expect the champions to carry it from there. Champions can't operate in isolation from business ownership either. They need real workflows to anchor training around. They don't need generic modules built for nobody in particular. All 3 groups have to stay in the same ongoing conversation. It's the same way platform and workload teams do in the Azure version of this loop. The moment any one of them checks out early, you get the exact same empty landing zone problem. It's just wearing a SharePoint site instead of a subscription. None of this works without training that actually changes behavior. It can't just be about awareness. Training is not awareness, it's behavior change. Let's be direct about something most companies fudge on their rollout slides. A lunch and learn is not training. Getting 40 people into a room for 30 minutes to watch a Copilot demo while they eat a sandwich is just an announcement with catering. It builds awareness that a tool exists, but it does not build the skill to use it inside a real workflow. Those are two completely different outcomes. And yet, they keep getting reported as the same line item. Here is the pattern showing up across Copilot rollouts right now. Licenses get pushed out to an entire department at once. Then the training gets reduced to a vendor demo. Someone from Microsoft or a partner walks through a polished set of slides and shows a few canned examples. They say some version of "this will save you time." But there are no concrete examples tied to what that specific team actually does all day. There is no walkthrough using their real documents, their real emails, or their real meeting notes. It is just a general promise that time will be saved once people figure it out on their own. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple. You have to define 5 to 7 high-value use cases per business unit before you deploy. Don't say Copilot can help with a lot of things. Instead, say, here are the 5 things it does for finance, or here are the 5 things it does for legal. These must be concrete tasks that someone already does every single week. That is the difference between a demo and training. A demo shows you what is possible in general. Training shows you exactly what to do with the work you are already stuck doing on Tuesday afternoon. And here is a detail that changes how adoption actually spreads. Deploy Copilot to teams, not individuals. When you hand out licenses one person at a time across an org chart, you leave everyone to figure it out alone at their desk. But when you deploy it to an intact team, social learning kicks in. Someone finds a prompt that works for a weekly report, and the person sitting 3 seats over copies it. Peer validation drives real adoption better than any training deck ever will. People trust what they see their coworkers doing more than they trust a slide that says it should work. There is one more piece that has to be built in as policy. It is what the research calls the review habit. Nobody should trust AI output blindly. This is not a nice to have you get to if you have extra time. It is a structural requirement, just like MFA is a structural requirement and not an optional security tip. Every piece of Copilot output must be checked by a human before it goes anywhere that matters. Every time. No exceptions for being in a hurry. If you skip that habit, you don't have an adoption problem. You have a governance failure with an AI logo on it. Now, here is where culture eats every framework alive if you let it. Culture and mental models, the layer frameworks ignore. Microsoft makes an admission in its own adoption guidance that is more honest than most companies are willing to be. Adoption fails when organizations focus on visible events and ignore culture and mental models. It doesn't fail because the tool is broken. It doesn't fail because training was skipped. It fails because leadership spends all its energy on the launch and the announcement, but never touches the actual thing sitting underneath it. They never touch how people think work is supposed to happen. Let's make that concrete. Mental models sounds abstract until you watch it play out in a real inbox. People have spent decades thinking about work in terms of email and shared drives. If someone needs a decision, they email the person who can make it. If someone finishes a document, they save it to a drive and email a link. At this point, that is not a habit, it is an instinct. So when Teams shows up, it does not replace that instinct, it just gets absorbed into it. Teams becomes chat, a slightly faster way to ping someone instead of emailing them. Meanwhile, the actual decisions still happen in someone's inbox. Nothing about where authority lives or how information moves has actually changed. You have a new interface sitting on top of an old assumption, and the old assumption always wins if nobody challenges it directly. This is why quick wins and cherry-pick pilots don't fix the actual problem. You can run a pilot with one enthusiastic team and get them using Teams channels beautifully. You can show a slide with a nice usage chart and call it proof. But a pilot like that does not touch how the rest of the organization thinks about ownership. It does not change the assumption about transparency or where information is supposed to live by default. It is just one team performing well inside a system that everyone else is still quietly ignoring. Cherry-picking a good result is not the same as changing the underlying belief that produced the bad ones everywhere else. This is the moment where the model earns its place as the core idea of this episode. You can install every single tool correctly. You can activate the licenses, provision the sites, and configure the permissions. You can schedule the training and name the champions. And you can still fail completely because the underlying assumption about how people actually work never got challenged. The tools were never the obstacle. The obstacle was always the belief sitting underneath them. And beliefs do not update just because the software around them did. Think back to the Roundabout one last time. The structure was never the problem. Roundabouts work. They are a genuinely better system than a traffic light with someone standing in the middle, directing every car by hand. The problem was the missing instructions. It was the assumption that people would just look at the new structure and understand it without being taught how. M365 is the same shape. The platform works, Teams works, SharePoint works, Copilot works. What is missing Every single time this fails, is someone actually teaching the organization the new rules for how information is supposed to move? You cannot assume the interface will explain itself. So does that mean we scrap the framework? No. Here is what it is actually for. The framework still works, but only as a guide. Let's be honest about what CAF and the M365 adoption guide actually are. Everything we've walked through so far could sound like an argument to throw them both out. But that's not the point. These are proven, battle-tested pieces of guidance, built from thousands of real deployments across companies of every size. They aren't wrong, but they aren't a single truth either. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. The right posture toward all of it is the same phrase we used for landing zones. One size fits none. That isn't a criticism of the framework. It's an instruction for how to use it. You take the structure Microsoft built and you adapt it hard to your own org's actual size and actual maturity, not the maturity you wish you had, or the one a case study assumed you'd have. Applied as written, without adjustment, it fits almost nobody perfectly. Adjusted with intention, it fits almost everybody well enough. But here's the problem. A small company with 30 employees does not need the full enterprise-scale landing zone. With every management group and policy tier the framework describes for a 5,000-person organization, building all of that anyway isn't thoroughness. It's over-engineering wearing the costume of best practice. And it costs that small company real time and real confusion for protection it doesn't need yet. Meanwhile, a large enterprise that skips that same rigor because it seemed like overkill is skipping the exact governance that keeps a company its size from quietly falling apart. What looks suffocating at 30 people is basic hygiene at 5,000. The framework doesn't fail either company. Applying it without adjusting for scale does. There's a smaller detail worth sitting with here because it says something about the framework's own trajectory. The documentation itself used to run about 3,600 pages, but it's roughly 1,300 now. That isn't because the guidance got worse or thinner in substance. It's because the people maintaining it got more disciplined about what actually needed to be said. And even at 1,300 pages, nobody's realistically reading that cover to cover before they touch a single resource nobody's expected to. So here's the honest use case, stated plainly. Use it as a map for direction, not a rulebook you follow line by line expecting a perfect outcome if you just comply closely enough. A map tells you where north is. It doesn't walk every step of the road for you, and it definitely doesn't know your specific terrain better than you do once you're standing on it. So if you're starting from scratch, or you're fixing a rollout that's already broken, here's the sequence that actually holds up. M&A and systemic integration, where this gets tested hardest. There's one place where everything we've talked about stops being theoretical and starts showing up directly on a balance sheet. Mergers and acquisitions. When two companies combine and their M365 environments have to become one, every structural weakness we've walked through gets tested at the same time, under a deadline, with money attached to the outcome. Post-merger integration is where structural adoption failure stops being a slow, quiet drag on productivity and turns into a number someone in finance has to explain. The research on this breaks measurement into 3 domains. It's worth naming all 3, because most integration teams only track one. First, there's technical integration health. Did the tenants, the identities, and the data actually merge cleanly? Second, there's user adoption and behavior change. Are people from both companies actually working the new way, or are they still quietly running 2 separate systems side by side because nobody forced the decision? And third, there's business synergies and risk. Is any of this technical and behavioral work translating into the financial outcome the deal was actually built to produce? Track only the first one, and you'll have a beautifully merged tenant that nobody's using correctly. Track only the second, and you'll have happy users with no idea whether the merger is actually paying for itself. Here's a detail from that research that deserves to be said plainly. It's a gut check for anyone who assumes a migration went fine just because nobody complained. 20 to 30% of migrated records typically need some kind of remediation after the fact. That isn't a failure, that's the expected range. Duplicate entries, broken metadata, permissions that didn't map cleanly from one system to the other. This is just the normal friction of moving real data between real environments. But once that number climbs above 40%, you're not looking at normal friction anymore. You're looking at a migration that got rushed, where corners got cut to hit a deadline, and the cleanup bill is going to land on someone's desk eventually. And this is where the financial expectations get set wrong almost every time. Revenue synergies, the actual new value the combined company is supposed to generate, lack cost synergies by 6 to 12 months. Cost savings show up fast. Cutting duplicate licenses and shutting down redundant systems is mechanical work. But revenue growth from better collaboration, faster deal cycles, and shared customer data actually being used well, that takes people time to build into their daily behavior. So if leadership is only measuring results in the first 100 days, they're measuring the part of the story that was always going to look good. And they are completely missing the part that actually proves the deal worked. This is the lesson worth carrying past M&A entirely. It applies to any org running any kind of structural integration, merger or not. This kind of change takes longer to show real value than leadership wants to admit. And that isn't a problem to solve. That's just the honest timeline. The fix isn't rushing the number. It's setting the expectation correctly up front. It's telling the people funding this that month 3 will look different from month 12. Judging the whole effort by the early numbers alone is how good integrations get killed before they had a chance to prove themselves. Let's pull this together into what you actually do Monday morning. The governance first sequence that actually prevents failure. So here's what you actually do. It is a sequence, and the order matters because it has to hold up under pressure. Governance audit first. Not after the rollout, not as a cleanup project 6 months later when the sprawl becomes impossible to ignore. You need to answer 4 unglamorous questions before you build a single workload. First, where does identity come from? Is it one clean source, or 5 systems stitched together with duct tape? Second, who holds admin roles right now, and can anyone actually explain why they have that access? Third, what is your default sharing posture? Is it locked down or is it wide open because nobody changed the Microsoft default settings? Fourth, what are your retention assumptions? Are they written down or are they just vibes and hope? If you answer those 4 questions honestly, you avoid the mistake that catches most companies. From there, security requirements are not negotiable. They are not complicated either, which is why skipping them is hard to excuse. MFA everywhere, no carve-outs for the executive who finds it annoying. Conditional access rules that check device health and location, not just a password. Role separation. The person who approves a policy should not be the same person that policy is supposed to constrain. And classification tied to actual record categories. Your labels need to match real data your company handles, not a generic template nobody customized. This is the flaw, not the ambition. The flaw. Once that is solid, build the operating model before you scale. Who owns what? Spelled out by name, not by department. Which group actually approves a new service request? You need this so it doesn't turn into a 3-week scheduling nightmare where use cases just stall out. What does the escalation path look like when something breaks? And who is empowered to say yes or no on the spot, instead of promising to circle back? Only after all of that is sitting on solid ground do you move to the part everyone wants to start with. Define use cases, assign champions, build a training curriculum around the workflows people actually run every day. The ordering matters more than it looks like on paper, because skipping straight to use cases without the governance underneath is how you end up with enthusiastic pilot teams sitting on top of an ungoverned mess. And this is worth tying back to something Barbara Forbes said about policy. It applies just as hard here. Policies are not a set it and forget it task. Most companies land in one of 2 failure modes. Too few policies, so there is no structure, or too many policies layered on top of each other until nobody knows what is actually enforced. Either way, the maintenance stops. Someone writes the policy, feels good about it, and never opens that document again. Governance that isn't revisited isn't governance. It's an artifact. And once governance holds, here is how you know if adoption is actually working. Building your actual scorecard. Here's the scorecard. It is laid out in 3 layers, and none of them work alone. That is the whole point of building it this way. The structural layer comes first. It tells you if the foundation can actually hold weight. Training completion, the real number, not training was offered, but what percentage of people actually finished it. Survey sentiment, pulled at intervals, not just once at launch when everyone is still excited. Champion activity, are the people assigned to carry this into their teams actually showing up? Or did that title stop meaning anything after week 2? And ticket trends, are the same confused questions landing in the queue 6 months out? Or have they tapered off because people actually learned the system? The usage layer sits on top of that. This is where most companies start and stop, which is exactly the mistake we spent the last several sections dismantling. MAU by workload, do not lump teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive into one number. A spike in one can hide a total collapse in another. Feature depth matters more than login counts. Someone opening Teams once a day to check a notification is not the same as someone actually running meetings and co-authoring documents. And Copilot prompt frequency, paired with satisfaction, do not report these alone. A high prompt count from someone who hates the output isn't adoption. It's frustration with extra steps. The outcome layer is the one almost nobody builds, and it is the one that actually matters to the people funding this. Cycle time reduction is a process that used to take 4 days, now taking 2, time saved, measured against a real baseline, not a vendor's estimate of what should be possible. Resolution speed for support tickets, customer requests, or internal approvals. Every single one of these has to tie back to a real business KPI, something leadership already tracks and already cares about, not a vanity metric invented to make the rollout look good on a slide. Here's the rule that ties all 3 layers together. It is the one thing worth writing down if you remember nothing else. Never trust one layer alone. A structural layer that looks great, with a usage layer that is flat, means people are trained and happy and still not using the thing. That is its own kind of failure. A usage layer that is climbing, with an outcome layer that is flat, is the most dangerous combination of all. It looks like success everywhere except in the place that actually counts. Rising usage with flat outcomes is not a win. It is a warning sign. It is dressed up in a chart that goes up and to the right. And it is exactly the kind of number that gets celebrated in a leadership meeting while the actual problem sits there unnoticed. Let's bring this back to the one sentence that matters most. The real transformation. Nobody puts on a slide. Strip away the framework diagrams. Forget the governance checklists. Here's the one sentence that actually matters. The framework was never the point. The model behind how your organization assumes people work. That is the point. It has been the point this entire episode, even when we were deep in the weeds talking about landing zones and RASI charts. Let's take one last pass at the roundabout. This time it's not a metaphor. It's the reality of your environment. The structure works. Roundabouts move more traffic with less waiting than a cop standing in an intersection ever could. Teams, SharePoint, and Copilot are built on that same logic. Freedom with guardrails, instead of someone manually approving every single move. But that structure only works for people who were actually taught how to enter it. They have to know how to yield. They have to know how to merge without causing a pileup. Nobody is born knowing how to use a roundabout, and nobody is born knowing that a team needs an owner and an expiration date. Both of those things have to be taught deliberately, or the structure just becomes a more elegant way to create the exact same confusion. Here is why this matters more right now than it did 2 years ago. Copilot does not fix a broken model. It just moves faster through whatever model already exists. If your organization has clear ownership, Copilot multiplies the good version of how you work. But if ownership is already fuzzy, if nobody can tell you who owns a site or why a workload moved to the cloud, Copilot does not slow down to wait for you. It just runs the dysfunction at a higher speed. Bad handoffs get automated. Unclear approvals get skipped instead of clarified. Whatever gap existed before, AI finds it and drives straight through it. That is the stake, stated as plainly as I can put it. The organizations that fix the model now are the ones who will survive. They are the ones who actually assign ownership, who actually build the operating model, and who actually teach people the new rules instead of assuming the interface will explain itself. Those companies will absorb the next wave of AI change without living through another failed rollout. Everyone else is going to keep doing the same exercise every 18 months. New tool, same governance gaps, same accountability confusion, just a different logo on the announcement email. So what do you actually do with this on Monday? Here is what you are walking away with. You now know why adoption fails structurally, not just technically. You know what actually predicts success in the data. Governance built before rollout. Accountability that is named instead of assumed. Metrics that measure all 3 layers instead of just the one that looks best on a slide. So here is the actual homework. This week, audit one workload's governance model. Just one. Pick something running in your tenant right now and ask 2 questions. Who owns this? And could anyone in your organization actually explain why it moved to the cloud in the first place? If the answer to either one is silence, you have found where to start. If this changed how you think about your own rollout, follow me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn. Send me your messiest adoption story, the one you would never put in a case study. It might be the next episode. And if you want more of this, leave a review. It helps more people find it.